All right, before we get into the next part about halftones, I wanted to show you one more thing in this image. Remember how we finished it with the texture and all this looks cool? Well, what if you wanted it in color, perhaps? Well, quite simply, I'm going to go over and select the topmost layer in the layer panel here. Go into the adjustment layer menu, and we're going to choose hue saturation. And it's going to open up the adjustment panel. Let's do adjustment panels in CS4. I love these things because you can make your adjustments live without the window being in your way. Well, let's go ahead and click colorize, and now I can just drag through the hue and give us a color. Let's increase the saturation. Give it a little bit of style. Looks pretty good. Go back to the layers panel. There's that adjustment layer. Everything looks cool. You can even turn off the texture and see what it looks like against the gradient itself. So, be experimental in trying different mixtures here. Mix it against the texture. Mix that texture with the original photo. Let's see what it blends with there and see what gets us. You see, it gives us a little bit of variation there, something different, but you never know until you try. But that's one way of using it. Now, let's talk about using halftones as graphic elements or building them as design elements. Well, I got a couple of other photographs here that I want to apply stuff to. So let's say I've got this graphic element. You can see it's on its own layer right here against the background layer. And I want to put some halftone elements back here. Well, quite simply, what I'm going to do is go into the File menu and go to New. And I'm just going to create a square document. Let's go with a 5 by 5. And we'll go and leave that at 200 and click OK. So, got a square document here. Well, what I'm going to do is go into the toolbar, and we're going to choose our gradient tool. And in the gradient editor, or the gradient selector here, we're going to choose the second one, which is foreground to transparent. And I do want to make sure that foreground color is at black. So let's go ahead and click the default button here. And not going to create a new layer. We're going to work directly on that background layer. I'm going to start in the middle of the document and just drag out a gradient. Again, making sure we are using that radial gradient, the second icon right here in the options bar. In that document, drag out so it draws me a gradient. Now, I don't necessarily want the edge of the gradient touching the edge of my document, and you'll know why in a minute. So, there's my gradient. I'm going to go into the filter menu now and go to Pixelate and choose Color Halftone. Now, normally by default, this is the default settings when you open up this dialog. Set max radius to 8, and it'll give you each one of these default channels. Well, what we're going to do here is set every one of these channels to 0. So I'm going to hit tab, 0, tab, 0, tab, 0. And the max radius really is a judgment call. And again, this is going to be something you're going to discover as time goes, but the smaller the number, the smaller the dots. Bigger the number, the bigger the dots. Really quite simple. But in this case, let's try 25. I'll click OK and see what we get. Gives me a pretty good dot pattern, and I think that works pretty good. So I think I'm going to go ahead and use that. Well, there's a couple of ways I can use this. Well, one way is I'm going to go ahead and take this and load it as a selection. So I'm going to go into my Channels palette, and I'm going to press Command or Control I to invert the values of this image. And I'm just going to hold down my Command key or Control key, and then click right on that RGB channel. It will load that image as a selection, or basically load those highlighted areas. Then, grabbing a select tool here, let's go in here and grab this selection. If we click inside, you can move it around. And we're going to drag it to the document we want to work on, which is this one right here. So I'm going to drag the selection up to the title bar. Again, this is something new in CS4, kind of cool. When you drag and hold, it will actually open up that image, not releasing your mouse until you get down inside the image, and boom, there is that selection. So let's do that again. That's really cool. So we're back inside here. Take that selection, drag it up to the title bar of the image you want to go to. It'll open up, drag down, release, and there you have it. So obviously the selection is very big inside this image, so let's go under the Select menu and go to Transform Selection. And I'm going to hold down my Shift and my Option key. That would be Shift-Alt on a PC, and it will scale it proportionately to the center. So we'll get it down to right about here. I'll click Enter. Now I'm going to go into my Layers panel, and we want to create a new blank layer beneath the image layer. So I'm just going to click the New Layer icon with that background layer selected, and now we're on a blank layer. Well, let's just go over here and get a color to fill this in with. So let's choose, perhaps, let's go crazy and get this green here. This purple right here. That looks good. Now I'm just going to press Option Delete, and we'll go ahead and fill the selection in, and let's deselect to see what we've got. So there is our halftone pattern right there behind the image. Well, to make it a little bit more interesting, we can do a couple of things to it. I'm going to press Command or Control T to bring up Free Transform, and then Control or right-click right on the image, and let's go down here to Distort. And let's make this shape a little bit more interesting. Pushing the perspective around will give you a more interesting result here. And we'll just right-click on that and go back to Free Transform, and I'll just rotate it a little bit. And that gives me an interesting halftone effect there. I could go ahead and duplicate this layer if I wanted to and maybe offset it. I'll do a Free Transform again and just rotate it. Bring it over here and maybe fill it with a different color. Let's get a really outrageous green. Why not? Put that right back there. Let's maybe rotate it a little bit more. Just like that. Simple, simple things that add a great deal of interest to your images. Now, that was bringing it in as a selection and then distorting it as a design element on its own layer. Now, another way of applying that is a very cool way is defining it as a brush. Let's go back to the original halftone pattern. I'm going to deselect here. What I want to do is define this whole halftone as a brush or as a preset brush. How cool would that be? Well, the first thing I need to do is actually invert the values, because when I define a brush in Photoshop, it looks at everything that's really dark in the image, and that's what's going to be the most opaque part of the brush. Anything that's white is going to be transparent. So I'm simply going to need to invert this. I'm going to press Command or Control I, and it will invert my values. And now let's go under the Edit menu to define Brush Preset. And you can go ahead and give it a name if you like. We'll go ahead and click OK. And let's go into a new image I've got here. And here I've got just this guy, the silhouette of a guy jumping in the background. Well, I'm going to go ahead and click on the background layer, and let's go ahead and create a new blank layer above that one. And we're going to go into the toolbar and select the brush tool. And let's go ahead and set our default colors and bring white to the foreground there. And let's go into the brush panel and select our halftone brush, which should be right there. There it is. So, looks good, everything. It's selected. Let's go and edit this in our brush panel. So let's go in here. And I'm going to activate the shape dynamics on this first, and we're going to set the angle jitter all the way to 100 and the roundness jitter all the way, well, not quite to 100. Let's do it to about 75. Then I'm just simply going to take the brush tip shape and just space it out just a little bit. And now, when I go in here, I want to make sure I'm painting with white. I'm going to go ahead and change the blend mode of this layer to overlay, so I can see the effect taking place as I paint. Now, I'm not going to click and drag to paint. I'm just going to click every now and then, and it will give me a separate orientation or a different orientation of that halftone pattern right around my subject. How cool is that? And you can do other variations with it too. I mean, at this point, I'd probably be done, and I probably painted a few too many, but I think you get the idea. But, you know, having that control over a halftone element on a brush is very cool. Now, one other cool thing you can do with it, just real quick, I'm going to create a new blank layer. Let's go back into those brush options and check this out. Let's actually get a color in here. I'm going to go to Color Dynamics, and I'm going to set the hue jitter all the way to 100% here. And watch what happens when I paint. It's going to just toggle through all sorts of colors through the color wheel, just jittering all the colors. So you can really create really funky backgrounds just by defining a halftone area as a brush, and then using this hue jitter to create a really, really freaky background colors. So very cool stuff with halftone patterns. I hope this gives you a nice springboard to try it on your own stuff and see what other kind of cool things you can get up with. So let's jump over to the next lesson.